It was supposed to be a show of strength. President Donald Trump had just imposed a sweeping 25% tariff on all Mexican imports, vowing to protect American jobs, curb illegal immigration, and force Mexico's hand. But within hours, it all backfired. Markets tanked. Factories panicked. And Mexico hit back with surgical precision, cutting off the auto parts that keep America's supply chain alive. Production lines froze. Workers were sent home. And the economy braced for impact. What happens when the parts stop moving, the workers stop working, and the voters stop believing? What's happening? This wasn't a protest, it was a precision strike on the very heart of American industry. In response to Trump's tariffs, the Mexican government announced that it would immediately halt exports of critical automotive components to the United States. This was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated economic maneuver designed to apply maximum pressure with surgical precision. Factories across the American Midwest, from Michigan and Ohio to Kentucky and Indiana, rely on daily shipments of components from Mexican plants. These shipments fuel the just-in-time manufacturing model that allows automakers to avoid expensive inventory stockpiles. Instead, parts arrive exactly when needed to keep production lines moving. Disrupting even one link in that chain is enough to grind entire operations to a halt. Mexico knew this. And that is exactly why they chose the auto sector. Within 24 hours of Mexico's announcement, reports began pouring in of stalled production at key facilities. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis were the first to sound the alarm. Assembly lines paused as shipments failed to arrive. Dealerships that had already been struggling with low inventory from pandemic-era shortages now faced a much worse crisis. Nothing was coming. Not this week. Not next. The Mexican government emphasized that the halt was temporary, conditional on the rollback of Trump's tariffs. But industry insiders warned that even a short disruption could cause cascading failures throughout the economy. With most American factories carrying only 2 to 3 days' worth of parts on site, the countdown to chaos had already begun. And the numbers were staggering. Mexico supplies over 87% of wiring harnesses used in American-made cars. It is responsible for more than 60% of small engine components, and over 70% of electronic modules used in hybrid and electric vehicles. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a decapitation strike on an industry that drives more than $900 billion in U.S. economic activity. The White House initially dismissed the threat, claiming Mexico would be more hurt than helped by its own export freeze. But inside the auto industry, no one was taking that gamble. Executives were calling emergency board meetings. Factory managers were preparing for shutdowns. And analysts warned that a multi-day halt could lead to billions in losses. But while automakers scrambled, Wall Street was about to get slammed. If this story has you fired up, don't just sit there, subscribe. Every twist in this economic standoff is changing the game, and we're breaking it down as it happens. Hit that button now and stay ahead of the headlines, because what's coming next? It's even bigger. The stock market panics, and so do the automakers. The tariffs weren't just hurting trade, they were destroying investor confidence by the minute. As markets opened the next morning, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped more than 600 points in the first hour of trading. Shares of Ford, General Motors, and Tesla plummeted. Even parts suppliers like BorgWarner, Magna International, and Aptiv saw double-digit declines. Investors weren't just worried about profits. They were terrified of systemic disruption. With just-in-time manufacturing now paralyzed, every link in the auto supply chain became a liability. Brokerage firms issued urgent downgrade alerts. Hedge funds began liquidating auto-related assets. And across the financial sector, panic spread like wildfire. The Nasdaq saw its largest single-day decline since early 2023. Bond markets wobbled. Analysts at Morgan Stanley compared the developing situation to the early stages of the 2008 financial crisis, only this time, it was trade-induced. The tech sector didn't escape the fallout either. Companies like Nvidia and Qualcomm, which supply chips used in electric vehicles, saw their valuations drop as production delays loomed. The ripple effect hit logistics firms, railways, and even commercial real estate developers with exposure to factory operations. Meanwhile, President Trump doubled down on social media, calling Mexico's move a bluff and vowing to hold the line. But inside the Beltway, concern was mounting. Senate Republicans urged caution. Business leaders called for emergency talks. And the Chamber of Commerce issued a rare public rebuke, warning of economic consequences on a scale not seen since the supply shocks of the 1970s. But the most explosive fallout wasn't on the trading floor, it was in America's factory towns. Rage in the Rust Belt. The very workers Donald Trump promised to protect are now the ones demanding his resignation. In towns across the Rust Belt, the fallout from the trade war hit like a sledgehammer. Layoffs began within 48 hours. Assembly lines were halted not by lack of demand, but by lack of parts. And for thousands of factory workers, paychecks stopped arriving almost overnight. In Flint, Michigan, hundreds of General Motors workers were sent home. In Louisville, Kentucky, Ford employees were told to brace for an indefinite shutdown. And in Lordstown, Ohio, where Trump once promised a manufacturing revival, workers gathered outside shuttered gates to protest. Their message was clear: we believed you. And now, we're paying the price. Union leaders who had cautiously supported Trump's America First rhetoric were now demanding an immediate reversal. AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler issued a scathing statement, calling the tariffs a betrayal of the American worker. Local union chapters in Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana organized emergency town halls, many of which devolved into shouting matches between disillusioned voters and local Republican representatives. The anger was not abstract. It was personal. These were the very communities Trump had won over with promises to bring back jobs, protect manufacturing, and stand up to globalism. Instead, his policies had triggered the most damaging manufacturing disruption in a generation. And it wasn't just jobs being lost. It was trust. Trust in leadership. Trust in promises. Trust in the future. Factory towns that once saw Trump as their champion were now calling for his ouster. Online forums that used to celebrate his trade toughness were now filled with images of empty parking lots and silent assembly lines. The political consequences were already being felt, and the economic damage was only beginning. And just when things couldn't get worse, John Deere enters the spotlight. John Deere crosses the line. When America's most iconic farm brand moved jobs to Mexico, it wasn't just business, it was betrayal. The company announced that it would shift part of its manufacturing operations out of Iowa and into Mexico. The timing couldn't have been worse. President Donald Trump had just imposed sweeping tariffs on Mexican imports, triggering a trade war that threatened to destabilize North American supply chains. And now, John Deere, a brand synonymous with American values, was choosing Mexico over the United States. The decision was framed as an effort to streamline operations and remain competitive in an increasingly volatile market. John Deere claimed it would move cab assembly operations to Ramos, Mexico, and begin transferring production of skid steers and compact track loaders from Iowa as part of a long-term cost-saving strategy. According to executives, these moves would help the company reduce overhead while continuing to invest in high-tech manufacturing at home. But to the American public, particularly those in the Midwest, this explanation rang hollow. Factory workers in Waterloo and Dubuque, Iowa were blindsided. Communities built around John Deere plants had weathered decades of agricultural downturns and industrial decline, believing that their loyalty and labor would be rewarded. Instead, they were met with pink slips and press releases. The emotional impact was immediate. Local news outlets reported tears on the factory floor. Bars and diners, once frequented by workers after shifts, sat half-empty. Small-town economies were shaken to their core. What stung even more was the perception that John Deere was abandoning its roots. Farmers who had grown up trusting the brand felt betrayed. Many questioned why the company would move jobs abroad during a time of economic uncertainty and political volatility. To them, John Deere's move wasn't just a business decision, it was a rejection of everything the brand claimed to stand for. And Trump? He responded with a threat that rocked the markets. The ultimate ultimatum. It wasn't a warning, it was economic warfare against a U.S. company. Within hours of John Deere's outsourcing announcement, President Donald Trump took the stage at a campaign rally in Indiana and dropped a bombshell. If John Deere proceeded with its plans to move jobs to Mexico, he would impose a 200% tariff on all John Deere products imported back into the United States. The crowd erupted. But behind the scenes, the business world panicked. This wasn't Trump's first time using tariffs as a weapon. He had previously strong-armed automakers and electronics companies into reversing outsourcing decisions by threatening financial penalties. But this was different. This was a direct attack on an American brand, not a foreign competitor. The implications were massive. Industry leaders immediately expressed concern. A tariff of that magnitude would destroy John Deere's margins on imported equipment, making it virtually impossible to sell those products domestically without massive price hikes. Analysts warned that the move could ripple across the farm equipment market, causing prices to skyrocket and supply chains to seize. Investors reacted accordingly. Within minutes of Trump's speech, John Deere's stock fell more than 1.5% in after-hours trading. Other manufacturing stocks began to slide as fears of broader trade retaliation spread. Legal experts questioned whether such a targeted tariff could withstand judicial scrutiny. Was it constitutional to punish a single company based on its manufacturing decisions? Would international trade courts intervene? And perhaps most importantly, would John Deere fight back, or would it bow to political pressure? Behind the scenes, internal meetings at Deere's headquarters in Moline, Illinois stretched into the early morning hours. Executives scrambled to assess the financial fallout. Would it be cheaper to absorb the tariffs or reverse course? Some board members reportedly urged a pause in the relocation plan. Others argued that giving in to political threats would set a dangerous precedent. The White House, meanwhile, doubled down. Trump's aides began floating additional tariffs on agricultural equipment, signaling that the administration was prepared to widen the battlefield. The message was clear: side with Mexico, and you'll pay the price. But Trump wasn't the only one coming after John Deere. The global shockwave: how Deere's move empowered Mexico. Mexico wasn't backing down, because John Deere just gave them the upper hand. As the United States faced internal division over the tariffs and outsourcing controversy, Mexico saw an opportunity to flex its growing economic power. Government officials hailed Deere's manufacturing move as proof that Mexico remained an attractive destination for global industry. In press conferences, they highlighted the country's skilled workforce, competitive costs, and advanced infrastructure. But this wasn't just about bragging rights. Deere's move gave Mexico a powerful narrative in the ongoing trade dispute. It proved that American companies were willing to defy the U.S. government's protectionist policies and invest in Mexico anyway. That narrative resonated across Latin America and beyond. And Brazil, promoting Mexico as a stable hub for manufacturing during uncertain times. The result? An influx of interest from global manufacturers. Auto parts suppliers, electronics firms, and machinery companies began eyeing Mexico as a long-term alternative to the unpredictable American regulatory environment. Deere may have been the first domino, but it wasn't the last. Mexico, emboldened by its sudden leverage, refused to blink in trade negotiations. The country knew it held a vital position in North America's supply chain, and it had just received a massive endorsement from one of America's most iconic brands. That confidence would carry into future talks. But the geopolitical implications didn't stop there. And as Mexico stood firm, China quietly made its next move. China's silent strike: farming without America. While the United States and Mexico clashed in a brutal trade war, another player quietly made its most strategic move yet: China. As Trump's tariffs ignited an economic firestorm across North America, Beijing did not need to raise its voice or retaliate with bombast. Instead, it leaned into its long-term plan, building agricultural independence and slashing its reliance on American farming. And the results? Devastating for the United States. For decades, American farmers had been promised that China would be their biggest customer. Experts, economists, and government officials repeated the same story: with China's massive population and rapid urbanization, it would need to import vast quantities of corn, soybeans, wheat, and meat. The United States, as the world's top food producer, would fill that gap. Trade deals were written with this assumption baked in. Farms expanded. Equipment was bought. Infrastructure was built. But that narrative has collapsed. Instead of leaning into imports, China made a massive pivot. Over the past 10 years, it has invested heavily in its own agricultural infrastructure. With government funding and strict policy mandates, China has boosted domestic food production by developing new high-yield crop varieties, expanding irrigation systems, and mechanizing its farming sector. Even more critically, it has poured billions into domestic equipment manufacturing, creating its own versions of tractors, harvesters, and seeders, often at a fraction of the cost of American brands like John Deere. Chinese equipment giants like YTO Group and Zoomlion have surged ahead. They do not carry the prestige of Western brands, but they are functional, increasingly reliable, and, above all, cheap. As developing nations across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America look to modernize their agriculture, many are choosing Chinese machinery over American alternatives. Why pay $200,000 for a tractor when you can get one that does the job for under $100,000? And while American farmers are still adjusting to this new reality, the geopolitical implications are profound. China is not just becoming self-sufficient, it is becoming a global agricultural supplier. Its strategy is not about winning a headline. It is about dominating the future. And for the United States, that future is looking bleak. And that collapse in exports? It was just the beginning of a total farm crisis. American farmers crushed, equipment, exports, and hope vanish. Crop prices collapsed. Equipment prices soared. And hope? That disappeared too. By the time Mexico's counterstrike took effect and China's strategy came into full view, American farmers found themselves in the jaws of an unprecedented economic collapse. The numbers were more than sobering, they were terrifying. Since the year 2022, the price of corn has dropped by more than 37%. Soybean prices have fallen by over 24%. Wheat, long a cornerstone of the U.S. agricultural economy, is down by 35%. These are not fluctuations. These are economic death sentences for farms operating on razor-thin margins. At the same time, the costs of farming have exploded. Diesel fuel is more expensive than ever. Fertilizer prices have doubled in some regions. And the equipment farmers rely on to plant, maintain, and harvest their crops? That is now out of reach for many. John Deere's machines have always carried a premium, but as inflation tightened its grip and interest rates soared, those prices became insurmountable. A new combine harvester can now cost upwards of $700,000. Even a mid-range tractor can push past $300,000. For family farms already hit by low crop prices and declining exports, these price tags might as well be a death warrant. The result is clear across the American Midwest: empty fields, half-used equipment, and auction signs popping up like weeds. Farm bankruptcies are rising, and the ripple effects are staggering. Equipment dealerships are struggling. Rural banks are tightening credit. Communities that have survived for generations on agriculture are withering under economic pressure. And John Deere? Its sales are down, particularly in its U.S. division. Farmers are no longer upgrading their fleets. Some are postponing purchases. Others are switching to lower-cost competitors or used equipment just to stay afloat. The company's move to outsource manufacturing to Mexico, once seen as a bold cost-saving measure, now looks like a desperate attempt to salvage profitability in a collapsing market. Even worse, many in the farming community feel betrayed. They supported John Deere through thick and thin. Now, in their moment of need, they feel abandoned. The company may survive the storm, but its relationship with its core customer base is broken. But even as farms collapsed, Trump reignited another old fire. The immigration crackdown that no one survives. When Donald Trump targeted undocumented workers, he accidentally crippled American farming. In a fiery campaign speech, Trump announced a sweeping crackdown on undocumented immigrants. New enforcement mandates. Expanded border patrols. Stricter penalties for employers. On the surface, it was about law and order. In practice, it was a direct hit to the backbone of American agriculture. Because the truth is simple, farming runs on immigrant labor. Over 70% of U.S. farmworkers are foreign-born, and the vast majority are undocumented. They pick the crops. They load the trucks. They work the fields in 100-degree heat when few Americans will. When Trump's crackdown began, the impact was immediate. Farms across California, Arizona, Florida, and Texas reported labor shortages. Crops rotted in the fields. Harvests were missed. Production slowed. Desperation set in. Farmers could not find enough workers to keep up with demand. And when they tried to hire legal residents, the labor pool was non-existent. The work is hard. The pay is low. And few people want the job. As the labor crisis deepened, prices surged. Consumers began feeling the pinch at grocery stores. Retailers raised prices. Supply chains were disrupted. And in the fields, the situation was growing more dire by the day. Protests erupted. Immigrant advocacy groups marched alongside farmers and agribusinesses demanding change. Farm owners who once supported Trump found themselves begging for leniency, asking for exemptions, or looking abroad for labor contracts that would take months to process. And for companies like John Deere, this posed a new challenge. Why would a farmer invest in new equipment if they cannot find workers to operate it? If their crops are rotting, their income vanishing, and their workforce fleeing, new machinery becomes the last thing on their minds. The immigration crackdown was intended to send a political message. But it sent a different message to the farming world: you are on your own. And now, with no workers, no parts, and no buyers, can anything save the U.S. farm economy? The answer may lie in what comes next. Because this crisis is not just economic. It is existential. Supply chain shattered, America's weak spot exposed. This wasn't just a trade war, it was a wake-up call to America's manufacturing weakness. As Mexico's retaliatory export freeze took hold, the backbone of the U.S. auto industry began to crack. Factory floors that once hummed with activity across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana fell silent. Automakers like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis were suddenly paralyzed, not because they lacked demand, but because they lacked parts. America's just-in-time manufacturing model, once hailed for its efficiency, turned overnight into a ticking time bomb. Vehicles sat half-assembled on factory lines, missing transmissions, wiring harnesses, and engine components that were stuck at the Mexican border. Workers were sent home. Entire shifts were canceled. Thousands of jobs were placed on hold with no clear timeline for return. The fragility of the system became undeniable. For decades, U.S. manufacturers had outsourced crucial production tasks to Mexican suppliers to cut costs and increase profits. But now, the cost of that decision had arrived. There was no backup plan. No alternative factories. No flexibility. Every minute that passed without resolution translated into millions of dollars in lost revenue. It was not just automakers that were suffering. The pain rippled outwards. Steel suppliers, logistics firms, parts manufacturers, and even tech companies that supported vehicle software were thrown into chaos. The trucking industry saw shipments rerouted or stalled. Warehouses overflowed with unused inventory that couldn't be assembled. Wall Street watched with growing panic as share prices plummeted and bond yields widened. Even companies that had previously boasted about their resilience were exposed. Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid found themselves equally entangled in the web. Their reliance on Mexico-based electronic components and lithium processors rendered them helpless. No amount of vertical integration could shield them from the cascading effects of a frozen border. The auto supply chain had become a microcosm of American vulnerability. Built for maximum efficiency, it had lost all agility. And while economists debated whether the trade war was a short-term tactical maneuver or a long-term strategic misstep, the reality on the ground was clear: American industry had no escape route. As pressure mounted and manufacturing chaos deepened, attention turned to Washington. If a solution was to be found, it would not come from the private sector. Behind closed doors, the first signs of movement began to appear. Secret talks, global pressure, and a diplomatic standoff. Mexico had the leverage. Trump had the ego. And the world watched as both refused to blink. With economic damage mounting by the hour, high-stakes diplomatic talks began under a veil of secrecy. The American public saw only press briefings and vague reassurances, but behind the scenes, negotiations were intense and deeply divided. Mexico made its position clear. It would not resume auto part exports until the U.S. lifted tariffs and provided concrete guarantees against future trade aggression. The Trump administration, meanwhile, refused to appear weak. The president's political brand was built on toughness, especially with foreign adversaries. To concede now would be seen as betrayal by his most loyal supporters. Into this deadlock stepped a parade of international actors. Canada, deeply intertwined with both Mexican and U.S. auto supply chains, offered to mediate. Prime ministerial envoys met with diplomats in Washington and Mexico City, urging compromise before the damage became permanent. The European Union expressed concern over the global economic ripple effects and warned of retaliatory measures if tariffs spread further. Even Japan, with major automakers like Toyota and Honda operating in North America, weighed in. Japanese trade officials pushed for resolution, emphasizing that prolonged instability would force companies to relocate production outside of the region. The message from the international community was unanimous: end the standoff, or risk unraveling decades of global trade progress. But neither Trump nor Mexican President López Obrador wanted to make the first move. The negotiations stalled. Trade envoys from both sides debated terms late into the night, cycling through proposals, counteroffers, and threats. Mexico insisted on binding agreements. The White House demanded symbolic concessions to maintain political cover. Days turned to weeks. Meanwhile, pressure in both countries grew. American automakers faced lawsuits from dealers over unfulfilled deliveries. Mexican factory owners began lobbying their own government to reach a deal. Still, nothing moved. The standoff became a global symbol of how fragile international trade really was. But amid the chaos, one truth was clear: the world just watched Mexico rewrite the rules. The question now is, will America ever catch up? What are your thoughts on this? Let us know your thoughts in the comment below.